chapter 37, but let's see where we are and where we're going. We are in the patriarchal history, which is the second major section of the book, and we're looking at Jacob, and we're starting into Joseph. We're finishing Jacob and starting into Joseph in chapter 37, and that'll carry us through chapter 50. So those are the patriarchs that we have been following, and now we're picking up on Joseph. Let's review our chapters. We have a lot to cover. So chapter 1, days of creation. Chapter 2, man in the garden. Very good. Chapter 3, Adam and Eve, sin. Chapter 4, Cain and Abel. Chapter 5, genealogy from Adam to Noah. 6, reason and preparation for the flood. Chapter 7 is the flood itself. Chapter 8, coming out of the ark. Chapter 9, God's covenant and Noah's drunkenness. Very good. Chapter 10, nations that come from Noah's sons. Chapter 11, Tower of Babel. Chapter 12, major chapter. Promise to Abraham. Very good. Chapter 13. Very good. Abraham did not return to Canaan. Chapter 14 is the war among the kings. Chapter 15, Abram is assured of the covenant. That's where in verse 6, Abraham believed God and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. Chapter 16, they're going to have God out. Hagar and Ishmael. Very good. Chapter 17, circumcision is given as a sign of the covenant. 18, yeah, 3 men visit with 2 announcements. Good. Chapter 19, destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Very good. Chapter 20, Abimelech takes Sarah. That's where Abraham lied about being his sister. Chapter 21, birth of Isaac. Very good. Chapter 22, offering of Isaac. 23, Sarah's burial, death and burial. Guess we've got to have her dead before we bury her, don't we? Chapter 24. All right. Rebekah's found for Isaac. Chapter 25. Abraham's death. Chapter 26. Isaac and Abimelech. Chapter 27. Jacob is blessed instead of Esau. Very good. Chapter 28. Jacob's dream. Yes. And chapter 29. Leah and Rachel. All right, let's go to 30. Chapter 30. Jacob's sons and prosperity. Chapter 31. Flees from Laban. Chapter 32. Yes, very good. Chapter 33. Jacob actually meets Esau. Chapter 34. Okay, and chapter 35. Jacob at Bethel and the death of Rachel and Isaac in 36. Family of the Edomites, family of Esau. All right, chapter 37, question 1. What's chapter 37 all about? Joseph is sold into Egypt. Chapter 38. All right, Judah and Tamar. And chapter 39 is a very familiar story. Joseph is sold to Potiphar, and he is tempted by Potiphar's wife. A lot of good stuff, practical stuff here in chapter 37 to 39. Here's 37. We've got a lot of ground to cover now. Chapter 37 is Joseph is sold into Egypt. 3 things happen. Joseph's brothers envy, and they hate him for 3 reasons we'll talk about in a moment, 2 of which are listed here. Probably should have put the 3rd one. Then brothers sold Joseph, and then the Midianites sold him to Potiphar in Egypt. And that's the storyline of chapter 37. The story of Genesis 37 and following through the end of the book is not merely some interesting stories. It's not merely about Joseph and Joseph's history. It's not a biography of Joseph. It's not just an interesting story about Joseph. We may tell it from that vantage point in the smallest of classes that here's an interesting story about Joseph. His brothers mistreated him, and he was sent off to Egypt, and da-da-da-da-da. But it's the story of redemption. Starting in chapter 3, after sin was introduced, the rest of the Bible, as well as the rest of Genesis, is a story about redemption. redemption that's going to come through the Messiah. And with that story, here's the story that God is preserving a nation. Let's get ahead of ourselves to chapter 46 of Genesis, if you will, and in verse 3. Genesis 46 and in verse 3. That God said, I am the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. There's a need for them going to Egypt. And the storyline is what happened to Joseph. And Joseph's mistreatment becomes the tool by which he gets the people into Egypt for two reasons. Or basically one reason that you could subdivide. And that is to preserve this nation. The Canaanite culture, because they're such a small nation at this juncture, there's 70 people when they go into the land of Egypt, so they're not very large. We'll have more people present in the building tonight than this nation was. When they come out, there's 600,000 men, not counting women and children, and some have estimated as high as 2 million when they come back out. So the point is God made them a great nation, and they were kind of off in isolation while they were in Egypt. But he gets them out of this Canaanite culture that is so corrupting to them. And that's the point of chapter 8, how corrupting the Canaanite culture was. But how did they get to Egypt? Well, they got to Egypt because he was sold into Egypt. And then the family comes down. So this is God's providence in taking care of his nation. So the point is, again, is not just merely the story of Joseph, but it's the story of redemption, God taking care and building a nation. And how can God do that and preserve them and get them into Canaan later, but preserve them out of Canaan before he brings them back into the land of Canaan? Make sense? That seems to be the storyline starting in chapter 37. Question number 2, why was Joseph Jacob's favorite son? Son of his old age and the son of Rachel, his favorite wife. Those two reasons is why he was his favorite son. So let's make our way through chapter 37. Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan, and this is the genealogy of Jacob. That tells me that this is the storyline that's going on that we just talked about. This is the genealogy of Jacob. Here's what this is all about. So now beginning at verse 2, we have the story of Joseph was about 17 years of age. That's going to be important a little bit later. Not the exact age of 17 versus 18 or 19 or 16, but that he was a young man, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. There are 3 reasons his brothers envied him. What were the 3 reasons? Because of favoritism, his father loved him more. Look at verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children because he was the son of his old age. And so he was a favorite son. That made them envy him. Verse 2. Okay, his dreams. Yes, his dreams later as he tells the story of his dreams. But back at verse 2, he gives a bad report to his father. And that didn't build for a good relationship between him and his brothers. So he goes to he's the favorite son. He goes first. Secondly, he goes to his father and gives a bad report about his brothers because they're misbehaving. No wonder. We're going to see some things in a moment and list a whole slew of things that have gone on among these brothers. And then thirdly, the dreams that he has, they were very envious of him. So verses 1 to 4 basically tell us that his father loved him more. And verse 4 says that the brothers hated him. They were envious of him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now beginning at verse 5 through verse 11, he has 2 dreams. What's the first dream? Yeah, he dreams that he and his brothers are out gathering sheaves, and his sheaves, or their sheaves, are bowing down to his sheaf. His stands up and theirs bowing down to his. And he tells his brothers about that. And that doesn't go over very well. Then he has a second dream. And what's the second dream beginning at verse 9? Well, before we do that, look at verse 8. That they understood the point of the dream. They got the point. Shall you indeed reign over us? So they hated him even more. So the envy and the hatred is growing. Then he has a second dream. What's the second dream? Verses 9 through 11. Yeah, the sun and the moon and the stars all bowed down before him. And he told it to his father and his brothers, and this was even too much for his father. What did his father say? Yeah. Are we going to bow down before you? And so his brothers envied him, but his father kept this matter in mind, which suggests to me his father pondered, what does all this mean? If this is a dream, and perhaps God has given this to him, what's all this mean? And he's going to find out before he dies, but he doesn't know that. And so his brothers envied him, and they hate him because of that. Now, beginning at verse 12, let's talk about his brothers selling him. Verse 11, just keep in mind that they are very envious, and they hate him, and they despise him. Now, his brothers are off with the father's flock at Shechem. Where did we read about Shechem? Yeah, those who had taken Dinah and remember Simeon and Levi went and slaughtered them all when they talked them into being circumcised. And while they're still recovering from all of that, they go in and slay them all. And so that's where the brothers have gone now. And they've gone there with their sheep. And so the father sends him off to Shechem to check on his brothers and bring back word concerning how they're doing. And now what happens beginning at verse 15? Yes, and so they've gone on to Dothan, which is about 15 miles north of Shechem. And so he takes off and he goes to Dothan and he finds them. And before they see him, before they talk to him, they see him coming for a while. And what do they refer to him as being? The dreamer, that literally the master of dreams. Here comes that master of dreams. And he dreamed up all of this stuff and told us about that. And so the mission was, at verse 20, they thought they would just kill him. Who stopped that? Reuben had stopped that, saying, let us not kill him, let us shed no blood, but let us cast him into the pit. And his thought was, yeah, I'm going to take him and save him and take him back to his father. And at least Reuben seemed to have some respect for his dad, if not for his brother. But then they came to pass that I'm getting down to a point, we're trying to get to chapter 30. I want to wrap up some things in 37, but then I want to get to 38 and spend some time there. So it came to pass, they stripped him of his clothes and the coat of many color, and they put him down into the pit, and they saw this band of Ishmaelites, the Midianite traders, coming and traveling through. And Judah raised the question, what profit is it that, I'm looking at verse 26, if we might kill him, and so why don't we sell him to the Midianites? And so they agreed. So they sold him for 20 shekels of silver, and therefore then the Ishmaelites took him off down to Egypt. Then Reuben came back, and what's Reuben's reaction? He's very upset because he said, the lad is no more. They think they've killed him, or he thinks they've killed him, and where shall I go? And so then they decided they'd scheme up this plan. And their plan was, let's take his coat, dip it in blood, and we'll take it back to the father and ask him if this is the coat. And he said yes. And notice how that evil they are to the father himself. Is this your son's coat? And they knew that what he was going to say. And Jacob tore his clothes, verse 34, and put on sackcloth, and he mourned many days. And his sons come to comfort him. Can you imagine the hypocrisy? And he says he'll go down to his grave weeping for his son. So then the Midianites took him and sold him to Potiphar, and that's the end of chapter 36. Now let's go back and wrap some things together in chapter 36. What I see is a story of what starts off with envy. I see how far envy can go. What started off as envy led to hatred, which led to conspiring to do something, which led to selling him, which led to wanting to kill him, but then they sold him, and then they lied to their father about that. So one sin led to another. That all started with this envy back here in chapter 37 and in verse 4. What else do you see in chapter 37? All right, yes, he did. He seemed to have some concern. Judah seemed to have some concern, at least for young Joseph. of trying to spare him. Let's not kill him. At least let's spare him. Let's sell him. But let's not kill him. But the others seem to be quite evil, and we're going to see why that's the case more in chapter 38 when we get to that. What? The text doesn't tell us at this point. I think he finds out later, but at what point did he find out, I don't know. But I'm assuming from verse 32 that, or verse 31, when they took his tunic and dipped it in the goat's blood and conspired that we'll go to our father and say this, that Reuben must have known what they were doing. And exactly his involvement or when he knew, I don't know. The text doesn't say. But at first he doesn't seem to know. He thinks they've killed him. Evidently from verse 30. Perhaps so. They're very wicked. They've been saturated with the Canaanite culture, and I think that's the storyline of chapter 38. That's the story. They've been saturated with the Canaanite culture, and they got to get out of there. Got to get them down to Egypt and get them isolated, and then let them grow into a nation before they can go back into the land of Canaan. That's part of the circumstance that we're talking about. All right. Anything else on chapter 37? Joseph being sold into Egypt. All right, let's go to chapter 38 now. Chapter 38, I call it Judah and Tamar, though there's really more to chapter 38 than that. Let's go to question number 7. Chapter 38 seems to be an interlude that illustrates the need to remove Israel from the Canaanite culture. And what do you see in this chapter that suggests that? All right, there's the use of a prostitute. All right, intermarrying with the Canaanites. What else? Right. Levirate vow, the Levirate marriage. Yes, it became a part of the law of Moses, but it was a part of the Jewish custom, apparently prior to that, as evidence here. We'll come back to that. Here's the point of chapter 38 that we've already mentioned. This seems to be an interlude because, why do I say that? You could take chapter 38 out of the text. Not that it's not important. And the text would seem to flow from chapter 37 right into 39. So we haven't covered 37. We just talked about how that the Midianites sold him to Potiphar. Now chapter 39, verse 1, now Joseph was taken down to Egypt and Potiphar, an officer of the guard, bought him, etc. The story continues on. We hadn't missed a thing. So there's an interlude here that seems to be focusing on the influence of the Canaanite culture and the need for getting Israel, that is the nation of Israel, as small as they are, out of the Canaanite culture and preserving them and growing them as a nation. Does that make sense? And so why do they need God? Look at the culture and its impact that it's had on them. Let's list some things. Already in chapter 34, there was the murder of the men of Shechem. Remember that? That was unjustified. That tells me their influence of the Canaanite culture. Number 2, there was Reuben's incest. Remember that? Number 3, there was the intention, though they didn't, their intention to kill Joseph. You say, well, they didn't do it. But the fact they talked about it and even contemplated that tells me their influence of the Canaanite culture. Now remember, Abraham had said, we'll come back to our list. Remember, Abraham had said, if there's no fear of God in them, they may kill me on the account of my wife. If they don't fear God, they just might be liable to kill me. These men are not fearing God. They thought about killing their brother. Thirdly, number 4, chapter 35. Remember the idols that Jacob asked them to remove? They had some idols with them. That's the influence of the Canaanite culture. They sold their brother. That tells me the influence of the Canaanite culture. They don't have much respect for human life. They lied to their father. Number 6. And now Judah marries a heathen. He marries a Canaanite. They didn't want that to happen with his sister. Remember that? But he's willing to do that himself. And then add to that, he commits the sin of fornication with Tamar. And so the storyline up to this point, this is kind of the culmination of it all, that finally, to use the language of the prophets, their iniquity is full. And this is more than they can handle. And so God's got to get them out of the Canaanite culture to preserve them, or they're going to just be absorbed into the Canaanite culture. And there will be no nation through whom the Messiah will come. So this is God's providence in taking care of them. So let's talk about verses 1 through 11. Here's Judah's family. Judah departed from his brothers. Why, we're not exactly told. However, it seems to be implied, because it follows on the heels of them having sold him, that perhaps it's over the brothers planning to kill Joseph, and that's perhaps why he thought, I just better get away from them, and so he departs. I don't know. But we're not told exactly, but it seems to be implied in the context. So he goes to a certain Adullamite. Adullam was in Hebron, in the Hebron Valley, according to Joshua 15 and in verse 35. And he runs into a friend there, makes a friend with a man named Hiram, or some translation I think call him Hiram. But anyway, through this friend, he found a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her and she conceived. All right, here we got a problem. He has married and taken a wife of the Canaanites that was not permitted for his own sister, and now we have a double standard. It wasn't right for her to do that, but it's okay for him to do that. We have a double standard. Now, let's get ahead of ourselves. At verse 7 and in verse 10, that led to his son's wickedness, because he's married in the Canaanite culture, and his son's become quite wicked. We'll get to that at verse 7 in a moment. There's the first name. The son is and the second was Onan, and the third was Shelah. I'm not sure the pronunciation of all of those, but I think that's correct. And then Judah found a wife for his eldest son, and her name was Tamar. Now that's important because of the lineage through which the Messiah is going to come that we're going to talk about. Now at verse 7, was so wicked that the Lord killed him. Now, how was that done? I don't know. Did the Lord directly do that? Well, he could have, because he did that in Numbers 16 a little bit later with Dathan, Korah, and Abiram. He opened the earth up and let the earth swallow them. So it could have been that they were so wicked and so full of iniquity that God just killed him. It's more likely that God allowed that to happen to bring his life to an end. But anyway, the Lord was involved in the killing of because of his wickedness. And by the way, there's a footnote. The driving out and the killing of the Canaanites when the children of Israel come back in for the conquest wasn't just so they could have the land. It was the punishment of the wickedness of the nations. We're going to see that in the book of Joshua. We miss that point sometimes. It's like the idea that we've sometimes presented, I think, or he is presented, that the children of Israel wanted the land, so just go in and kill the people so you could have the land. God was actually punishing the people that was already there because of their wickedness. And that God often did that. Now then, at verse 8, Judah said to his second son, Onan, to go in and become the husband and bring up a child by Tamar. Now, that's not, we're not to the Old Testament, we're not to the law of Moses yet, Deuteronomy 25, but if you want a reference on that, Deuteronomy 25, the Jewish custom and later the law was that a brother was responsible for bringing up seed in case he died and there was no seed left. There's no child that his brother was to marry, and if that one brother died, then the next brother was to marry until they have the seed brought forth. Now, Onan, perhaps thinking about himself, and some have suggested that he was thinking that because he's now the eldest and he would have double portion, that he may lose part of that. So he refuses to actually impregnate her, and consequently, verse 10 says that displeased the Lord, which means it's not just a matter of Jacob's idea, but this seems to be a part of the custom of the family. and of the nation. And the Lord killed him also. Now what happens at verse 11? Yeah, until the third son comes along and he's old enough. He's not old enough yet to get married, and when he's getting older, he has no intention of doing that. But notice what Jacob said, or Judah said. Judah said, he said, lest he also die as his brothers did. It seems like he's blaming Tamar for their death. And actually it was their sin, and it was actually partly his responsibility, because he married a Canaanite woman and introduced that culture to them that they became so wicked. But he blames her, seemingly, in verse 11, and so he has no intention of giving her. Now, let's get ahead. Let's go to verses 12 to 23. Judah lies with Tamar. As he is making his way to the sheep Timnah, to the sheep shearers, someone told Tamar that he's headed there, and something else in the mix that he's failed to do that he promised, to give the third brother, and he doesn't do that. So she goes and she takes off her widow's garments and covers herself with a veil. Most commentators suggest that the harlot of the time would completely cover her face. So that's why he would not recognize her, and so perhaps she could even disguise her voice, and he would not know that this is his daughter-in-law. And as Judah goes along and he sees this woman sitting there and her face covered, notice verse 16, he approaches her and says, let me come in unto you. He's approaching her thinking she is a harlot. And in the interest of time, what does she do? She's setting him up because she wants to have a child and have the seed from his family. She makes sure she gets the evidence. And so she asks for his signet. It's perhaps a cylinder. Some suggest it's a cylinder that was worn with a rope or a string around the neck, or a ring that had the signet ring or a seal. And so basically it's his signature, his branding iron, so to speak. That would be his official way of signing off his name, or at least transacting business. And she asked for that, and his staff, well, he says, okay, I'll give that to you as a pledge till I send the young goat to you. And then she goes away. Well, then he seeks to find her, and he can't find her. And notice at verse 23, when his friend can't find her, what does Judah say? We're not going to pursue her real hard to find her. Just let her keep that, and we'll just let that go, because lest we be ashamed. He's more concerned about what men thought of him than what God thought about him. Notice again the influence of the Canaanite culture, how corrupt the nation or the people are becoming. Now verse 24 beginning through verse 26, Tamar is now with child, and it's reported to Judah, and he thinks, well, I'll tell you what, she's been out playing the harlot, and so bring her here and let her be burned. We have again a double standard. It's all right for him to go into a harlot, but it's not all right for Tamar to go and play the harlot. He didn't think. And he said, let her be burned. And so she comes in and presents the signet ring and said, this is the man by whom I'm pregnant. And he had to identify. And his acknowledgement was, she's more righteous than I. And when she gave birth to two sons that are identified as Perez and Zerah. And depending on your translation, it may be spelled differently in that. Now, here's the importance of Tamar. If you'll notice here that we have Judah up here. Judah gets married, and he has a relationship with Tamar, and through Pharez, I believe that's the King James rendering of that these little crosses represent the lineage through whom the Messiah is going to come. So it is through Judah down to Pharez or Perez, all the way down to Boaz is in that line. And from Boaz then we go down to Jesse and on down to David. So this is the lineage through which the Messiah is coming. This is the lineage of David. Making sense? So as corrupt as Tamar was, as corrupt as Judah was, this is the lineage through whom the Messiah is going to come. And we'll come back to that lineage a little bit later. So Tamar is very important in the line and in the lineage. But the point I'm wanting you to see is the influence of the Canaanite culture. That's why they've got to get out of the land of Canaan and get them to a better place. This is how it's going to happen now. Let's go to 39. Let's spend the rest of our time in 39. 39 is very, very practical chapter because this has the storyline of Joseph being sold, and he brings prosperity to Potiphar. He's sold to Potiphar, and he bought him from the Ishmaelites, and the Lord was with him, verse 3, and all that he did was made to prosper. And Potiphar took note of that, to the point that verse 5 says what? In 6. Absolutely. He became the overseer of everything. In fact, there was nothing that Potiphar had that wasn't put under his hand. So Potiphar didn't even know all that he owned and all that he had, and didn't even know all the money that he had and all the wealth that he had, because he turns that all over to Joseph, because he recognizes the Lord is blessing him because of Joseph. And Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance. Very loose translation, not this one, that's a good translation, but some of the more free translation says, but it's really what it's talking about, it says he was well built and he was handsome. And so he was good looking, and was the young man named Joseph. Now, Joseph, so some time has passed. He's older than 17, and he was 30 years old when he's let out of prison, and he'd been there for 2 years. So he's somewhere between the age of 18 and 28 years of age at this point. So he's a young man. Get that picture. And so let's talk about what Potiphar's wife did to him. This is a very practical section. Verse 7 says, she cast longing eyes at Joseph. What does that tell you? I'm sorry? All right, she's got lust in her heart. The New American Standard translates that she looked with desire at Joseph. The Living Bible says she began making eyes at Joseph. Proverbs 6 says, do not let her allure you with her eyelids. She apparently is casting her eyes in a way that she can say more with her eyes than she can say with her lips. Some translators suggest that that doesn't mean she was making eyes at Joseph, but that she set her sights on Joseph. And some translations, I think, render it as such. Either way, the point's the same. She either was making eyes, trying to seduce him, or she set her goal and her sights on him. I am going to seduce him. Either way, she's targeting Joseph. I'm going to seduce him. And she says, here's how far I'm willing to go. She says at verse 7, lie with me. Now, I have a sermon I preach in nearly, I'm going to say about 80% of the meetings I'm in, where I talk about the seduction of Joseph. And I spend a good bit of time talking about the temptation was strong. And this was not a mild temptation where he was slightly tempted and he could easily walk away, but it was tremendously strong when you consider how young he was. He's 18 to 28 years of age. There were few young men in Egypt that could have resisted that kind of temptation. This would when his desires would have been raging at their height, between 18 and 28 years of age. When you consider that she was the one soliciting him, he's not making eyes at her, she's the one that's making eyes at him. She's making a pass at him, saying, here's how far I'm willing to go. And she told him, here's what I'm willing to do. She's not flirting with him only when he begins to respond, saying, oh no, I'm just teasing. She says, here's how far I'm willing to go. The temptation was strong. And notice the repetition of it. Notice at verse 11, or verse 10. So it was that as she spoke to Joseph day by day. This wasn't a one-time thing, but day after day after day after day, that's designed to break him down. And then add to that finally there's a convenient opportunity. Look at verse 11. What's the convenient opportunity? No one else around. None of the men of the house was inside. The temptation was strong. It was tremendously strong. But the resistance was firm. Notice he resisted with words. I want to notice 5 things that he said. Basically, at verse 8, when the text says he refused, what does that mean? He said, no, I'm not going to do it. He refused. He said no. There's a second thing he said at verse 8. He spoke of trust. My master trusts me. The master does not know what is with me in the house and has committed all that he has into my hand. My master trusts me. Someone trusts me. Your husband trusts you. Your wife trusts you. Your parents trust you. Your children trust you. There's a third thing. Verse 9. Well, before that, he has not kept back anything from me but you, because you're a married woman. He recognized the sacredness of marriage. The fourth thing he said, how can I commit this great wickedness? This is immoral. And furthermore, it is number 5, a sin against God. It's not just against her. It's not just against Potiphar. Not just against himself. It's against God. So he had 5 things he had to say about it. He resisted with deeds. There were 2 things he did. What were the 2 things he did? Let's start with the last one, most obvious, that we all talk about and we tell the young kids. He fled and ran outside. We'll come back to that. What was the first thing he actually did? Verse 10. He refused to be with her. The New International says, or even to be with her. Living Bible says he kept out of her way as much as possible. When he realized she was a tempting circumstance, he avoided her rather than trying to get close to her. Let's see what's going on. Reminds me of Proverbs 5. And he resisted promptly, and he resisted firmly. Let's go down to verse 12. That as she was in the house with Joseph, she grabbed him by the coat, and he fled and he ran outside, the text said. That may, as we pointed out Sunday, that may involve literally getting out of the house or getting out of the car, getting out of the apartment, getting out of the room, and literally fleeing and running. As hard as that may seem to do, that may be what needs to be done. Now, Joseph realized some things when he gets out on the outside that is obvious from this context. And that is, there's a difference in love and lust. How do I know she doesn't love him? She was lusting after him. I know that because she said, come lie with me. How do I know she doesn't love him? She lied about him. Yeah, when he refused her, then she lied about him and said he tried to rape me. That's what he basically is saying, or she's saying. And she told her husband that. Led him to be thrown in prison. She has no concern for Joseph. And so here's a practical thing that every young person and an older person, for that matter, needs to know. There's a difference in love and lust. Lust is not the same as love. Sooner or later, all illicit desire that is balked turns into hatred eventually. Well, as we end the story, our time is about gone. Verses 19 to 23. Let's go back to our outline. As we end chapter 39, Joseph is put in prison, and that's where he's going to be kept for about 2 years, and then later he's going to be released. But then his hand is made to prosper. But I want to go back for a moment. Potiphar had the power to execute Joseph, but he didn't do that, which makes me wonder if he didn't think that she was lying. But he's caught in a rock and hard place. He has to accept what she says, but it seems to me he might have known that his wife was lying. If she is this kind of seductive woman, Joseph certainly wasn't the first and wasn't the last. Because if she's the one who would go to Joseph and say, come lie with me, and Joseph refused, then the next young man that's handsome in form and appearance comes along, she's going to say, come lie with me. And I doubt that was the first time that it happened. I don't know that, but It seems that if he really thought some woman, some man tried to, a Hebrew after all, comes in among the Egyptians and tries to rape his wife, he'd have him executed. He must have thought, I don't know, I don't buy this story. And so he put him into prison instead of executing. Yeah. And it makes you wonder if anybody else bought that story. But anyway, she tells that story about him trying to rape her, which he did not. Any questions or comments on chapter 39? We've got about 3-4 minutes to go. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good point. Absolutely, that's a good point. You know, and one of the things I try to point out when I'm preaching on Joseph is that we sell our young people down the road sometime as people who are not interested in spirituality. Here's an example of a young person who has deep faith and has moral purity. And perhaps there's many Josephs among us today. One of the things that's quite interesting to me is what Joseph left in the house when he left. He left his coat in there, that's obvious. Garment, whatever it was that she took off of him. He left that inside. He left his reputation among men inside because the story's being told he raped me, tried to rape me. Left his job, and he left his freedom inside. But he brought a lot of things out. He brought his purity out. He brought his conscience out. He brought his reputation among the godly out. Evidence of that, we're talking about him tonight, aren't we? We hold him in high esteem. And he brought his moral purity, brought all that out with him, which is far more valuable than that coat he left inside and the job that he had, etc. Many practical lessons in chapter 39, I'm sorry. I want to go back in, our time is about gone. Wish I had more time to develop some of the other verses, but verse 11, touching on what Stephen talked about a moment ago, it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house and none of the men in the house were inside. There is danger of being with the opposite sex when no one else is around. I'm not saying it's always wrong. I'm saying that to be in a parked car, be in an apartment, to be in a house, to be around the opposite sex for a long period of time, there is danger of temptation. And I see that at verse 11. None of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by the garment and said, "Come lie with me." Anything else on chapter 39? We'll stop there. Chapters 40 to 43 next time.